Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my in-depth review of the Sony FE PZ 16-35mm f4G, an ultra-wide-angle zoom lens for their full-frame E-mount mirrorless system. And yep, I'm going to be pronouncing it Z, not Z. Launched in March 2022 and costing between $1,200 and $1,400, the PZ in the title stands for Power Zoom, employing motors to drive the zoom smoothly and at a variety of speeds, not to mention remotely if desired. It's also compact, light, weather sealed and sports Sony's usual wealth of controls, including a declickable aperture ring, although interestingly there's no optical stabilization, so it relies on IBIS in alpha bodies or an optional gimbal to iron out any wobbles. Sony loaned me the lens to test, and in this video I'll show you what it can do and in particular how that power zoom works out in practice. The PZ 16-35 actually becomes Sony's fourth lens to sport this popular range. Most obviously, there's the f2.8G Master from 2017 that costs $2,200, and the f4ZA from 2014 costing $1,350. But there's also the T3.1, a dedicated cinema lens with a detachable servo zoom that costs $5,500. For this review, I'll be directly comparing the PZ f4G on the left with the f4ZA OSS on the right. That's a collaboration with Zeiss that may be 7.5 years older, but it remains on sale, sharing the same range, the same aperture, and much the same price too. With them side by side, you'll see both lenses share a similar diameter with the same 72mm filter thread, but the new PZ lens is 10mm shorter, and once you pick them up, you'll notice a significant weight difference. Just 353 grams for the new PZ lens versus 518 for the old ZA. Now that 165 gram saving may not sound like much, but I really noticed it when walking around with the lens on a body all day, and that makes it an ideal travel or hiking companion. And of course, if you're mounting it on a gimbal or especially on a drone, any weight saving is beneficial. Now the secret behind the compact size and weight is actually the power zoom itself. Without the need for a mechanical control, this lens can exploit two separate optical groups synchronized by 4 linear motors to perform the zooming process. These in turn allow a smaller barrel that doesn't extend when zooming. It's an interesting solution to a problem you didn't realize you had, but certainly allows more compact lens designs with the benefits of a motorized zoom. Sony also describes the PZ lens as being dust and moisture resistant, and unlike the Zeiss model, there's a rubber grommet at the mount. Moving on to controls, there's an aperture ring closest to the mount, clicked at 1/3 intervals between f4 and f22, but declickable for smooth operation with a switch on the other side. Alongside are an AF/MF switch, a programmable focus hold button, and a spring-loaded lever, one of the many ways you can operate the power zoom, more about which in just a moment. Then there's the zoom ring itself, followed by the manual focusing ring. The zoom ring is a little more damped than the looser feeling focusing ring, but they do feel quite similar in practice. They're both free spinning with no hard stops or any labelling on the barrel. Also notice how the zooming takes place internally with no extension of the barrel, so there's no need to rebalance it if you're using a gimbal. Being motor assisted, the zoom ring is also reversible in operation with compatible cameras, including the A7R Mark IV here, offering a menu to configure its direction. The focusing ring is also linear in response. Sony supplies the PZ lens with a petal hood that twists on and off, and it's reversible while still providing access to the zoom ring. For comparison, here's the Zeiss 16-35 already looking heftier with its longer barrel. In contrast to the control-packed PZ lens, the Zeiss model has no switches, no buttons and no aperture ring either, just a traditional zoom ring which extends the barrel a little and has hard stops at either end, and a motor-assisted focusing ring at the end. Both of the rings on the Zeiss lens felt stiffer than those on the PZ lens. The Zeiss lens also comes with a hood, but it was missing on my sample. Right, now for what makes the PZ lens unusual, the motorized zoom, and you're seeing it in action here for video, zooming smoothly through its optical range from 16 to 35mm using the rocker control on the side of the barrel. This control has 2 speeds depending on how far you push it, taking about 14 seconds for the full range when pushed very gently, or around 2 seconds when pushed all the way. In theory, it's like the motorized zooms that you'll find on compact or super zoom cameras, but thanks to the linear motors which drive it, the process is much smoother with a constant speed and no distracting lurches or axial wobbles. You can alternatively use the zoom ring to adjust the focal length, as seen here when composing photos. The ring allows you to make pretty quick or subtle adjustments, and again it avoids the lurching of cheaper power zoom lenses, like Sony's own 16-50 kit zoom for the a6000 series. The zoom can also be operated by compatible cameras sporting a rocker control of their own, like the ZV-E10 or FX3, and these models allow you to adjust the speed in 8 steps from the menus. Newer alpha bodies like the A7 IV alternatively allow you to assign the zoom control to custom buttons, like pushing the rear wheel left or right or using the touchscreen, and again with up to 8 speeds from a menu. If you choose the slower speeds, it's also possible to seamlessly transition into a digital zoom using Sony's clear image option to extend that range further. Here's the A7 IV zooming the lens during a video using the wheel control. And if you are filming with the aperture wide open, you'll appreciate the constant f4 ratio, not varying as the focal length is adjusted. It all adds up to the most practical, responsive and smoothest power zoom experience that I've tested, but it still can't help feeling more detached than a traditional mechanical zoom ring. And the absence of hard stops or any labelling on the barrel means there's also no feedback when you reach the extremes of the focal range other than to check the screen or viewfinder. Plus, even at its fastest speed, it's still not as quick to crash back and forth through the range as a simple manual twist. So it works well, but what's the point? Well, the most obvious benefit is for video users, where you can smoothly zoom in or out of a scene at a choice of speeds. I generally use this with the lens started fully zoomed in, before zooming out slowly to reveal the full picture. It's a nice effect. For stills photography, when you're behind the camera though, there's less of an obvious benefit. While it is the most responsive power zoom that I've used, I still personally prefer the feel of a traditional mechanical system. But step away from the camera and the power zoom becomes more compelling. You can operate it by remote control, say from your phone or a dedicated accessory when taking group shots or presenting pieces to camera. You can adjust it without touching the barrel when it's mounted on a gimbal, and again the non-extending barrel means no rebalancing. And taking this to an extreme, the zoom could also be operated remotely while the camera is mounted on a drone while it's in flight, where again its lightweight is a boon. But again, the hidden benefit of the power zoom for anyone who's using it is the simple fact that it makes the lens smaller and lighter than a traditional mechanical solution, and that non-extending barrel is going to be easier to seal as well. I'd love to hear what you think about this solution and also how you'd use it. Okay, now for my tests, starting with focusing for still photos with the PZ 16-35 mounted on the A7R Mark IV at 16mm f4 with a central AF area and single AF mode. Here the focusing is almost instant with no fuss. Switch to the older Zeiss 16-35, again at 16f4, and you'll see it's visibly a tad slower, but it still gets the job done quickly enough, and both lenses were equally quiet. Now back to the power zoom model, this time at 35mm f4, where the focusing is again almost instant. There's certainly no hanging around here. And for comparison, the Zeiss 16-35, again at 35f4, where it remains visibly a little slower with more of a wobble to confirm. It's nice that the new lens is faster, but the older one is still perfectly usable, and I'll show you some video tests later. Okay, now for my optical tests, but before launching into my comparisons, a quick look at lens corrections. Like most modern mirrorless lenses, especially wide ones, the PZ 16-35 employs profiles to correct the geometry. Here's a grid pattern for an outer camera JPEG at 16mm where the corrective profile is applied automatically and it looks nice and square as you'd hope. And now here's the raw file where the profile hasn't yet been applied. Switching between them shows the work that the profile is doing at 16mm where the lens has pronounced barrel distortion, but again it's corrected automatically by the camera for JPEGs and also for raw files so long as your converter has the profile for it. If it doesn't, I found that either of Sony's earlier 24mm profiles will get you pretty close. For comparison, here's the older Zeiss 16-35 at 16mm with the profile applied to a raw file, and now for the version without the profile applied. Switching between them shows this model has much less distortion to correct, but how does that actually impact real life results, especially in those corners? Let's find out. So here's my distant landscape scene, angled so that details run right into the corners. All the results were taken with each lens mounted on an A7R4 body using a central AF area, and they're all JPEGs out of camera. Let's start with the PZ 16-35 at its widest 16mm focal length, and zooming in on the middle shows a detailed, high contrast image out of the gate at f4 with no benefit here to stopping down any further. Placing the PZ on the left, with the Zeiss at 16mm f4 on the right, shows both lenses looking very similar in this first comparison. Moving out into the corners of the PZ image shows some softening as well as darkening from vignetting, but with the PZ image on the left and the Zeiss on the right, you can see how the new model is sharper in the extreme corners when both are set to 16mm f4. Closing the aperture on both lenses to f5.6 sees the vignetting reduced and a minor improvement to sharpness on both lenses, and that improves a tad again when close to f8, but the newer PZ model on the left stays ahead at each aperture setting in this test. Now if you were to focus the Zeiss lens in the corner, it can deliver sharper results in that particular area, but if you want fine detail across the whole frame, the PZ lens edged ahead in this test at 16mm. Next, for them roughly midway through their ranges at 24mm, starting again with the PZ 16-35 and again wide open at f4. Looking closely in the middle again shows loads of fine detail and high contrast. Placing the PZ lens on the left and the Zeiss on the right, both at 24mm f4, again shows very similar results, albeit perhaps a tad higher contrast from the PZ on the left. There's nothing really to be gained here in the middle from closing the aperture any further. Head into the corners of the PZ image at 24mm and you'll see it resolving finer details than at 16mm and looking very well corrected right into the corner, wide open. Place the PZ on the left and the Zeiss on the right though, and you'll see the older lens on the right becomes visibly softer the closer you get to the extremes. The newer lens on the left is clearly outperforming it here, at least in terms of a flatter field. Closing the aperture to f5.6 and then to f8 makes minor improvements to the Zeiss image on the right, but the PZ on the left already looks so good at f4 that it has little to gain from stopping down other than to lift some mild vignetting. So a clear lead from the newer PZ lens midway through their ranges, although if you were to focus in the corner, the Zeiss will improve. And finally for bright and peer at the long end of their ranges, starting with the PZ lens at 35mm f4. Taking a closer look in the middle continues the story of sharp details and high contrast with no reason to stop down further. But place the PZ on the left and the Zeiss on the right, both at f4 and focused in the middle, and you'll notice the older Zeiss is a fraction softer when wide open. It's not bad, it's just that the newer PZ is better here. Closing the aperture first to f5.6, then to f8 will however boost the sharpness on the Zeiss to a similar level, but the PZ lens is performing better out of the gate. Heading into the corner of the PZ image, here back at f4 again shows decent detail with little to complain about. Placing the PZ on the left and the Zeiss on the right again illustrates how the newer lens benefits from a flatter field with more consistent sharpness across the frame. Closing the aperture to f5.6, then to f8 makes big improvements to the Zeiss image on the right, which is looking pretty good by f8. The PZ lens on the left also benefits from closing down, but by less as it's already looking really good at f4. Again, if you were to focus the Zeiss in the corner, it will be sharper here, but for a flat field that's sharp across the frame, the newer PZ outperforms it as the focal length increases. Next for a portrait distance test, first with the PZ 16-35 at 35mm f4 and focused on me using the A7R4's face and eye detection. While you're never going to get very shallow depth of field effects from this distance at 35 f4, there's still a little blurring in the background, and if you take a closer look, very sharp details in the focused areas around my eyes. With the PZ on the left and the older Zeiss on the right, you'll see the new lens delivering a higher contrast image that looks sharper too, although look closely and the older Zeiss is resolving the finest details just as well. But out of camera, the PZ definitely looks crisper. Meanwhile, when comparing the rendering of out of focus areas, I'd say neither lens looks amazing nor takes a clear lead. Both have textures within the blobs in the background and fairly busy bokeh, so don't expect the Zeiss to necessarily enjoy an edge here. To really evaluate those bokeh blobs, here's a test close to their minimum focusing distance, starting with the PZ at 35 f4, where you'll see small blobs that are mostly well behaved with only subtle outlining and textures within. With the PZ lens on the left and the Zeiss on the right, you'll notice slightly greater magnification from the latter when both are positioned at the same distance and set to 35mm. As such, the bokeh blobs are also larger from the Zeiss, and they're less elongated than the PZ in the corners at their maximum apertures. But taking a closer look reveals greater textures within those blobs and more defined outlining. Now, bokeh and rendering is always a personal choice, but I'd say the newer PZ lens on the left is looking better here. Plus, despite both lenses quoting the same minimum focusing distance, I actually managed to get the PZ lens to focus a little closer at the 35mm focal length, where you can see it here delivering similarly sized blobs as the Zeiss. This in turn though has made those textures a little more obvious though, so neither is going to satisfy as a bokeh monster. In fact, do you have a preference between them? Right, now for some video tests, and you've already seen how the PZ lens can deliver dramatic perspectives with the chance for smooth zooms back and forth. But what's it like for focusing? Here's the PZ at 16mm f4 filming video on the A7R Mark IV with a central AF area and continuous AFC, where the focus pulls back and forth are smooth and avoid overshooting. Zoom the PZ lens to 35mm, still at f4, and it again delivers consistent performance, although a lot of this is also dictated by the body in question and the default settings. Remember, you can change the focusing speed and response time. For comparison, here's the Zeiss at 16mm f4, again on the A7R4 using the same default settings, and now at 35mm f4 with very similar performance, so no issues there. Next for face tracking, starting with the PZ lens at 35mm f4 on a tripod mounted camera with the focusing driven by face and eye detection on the A7R Mark IV, and as you'd expect, no problems here. If you prefer to capture more of your surroundings, here's the PZ lens filming at 16mm f4, again from a fixed position with the A7R4 using face and eye detection. Obviously there's some distortion as you move up close towards the edges, but that's normal for 16mm, and if you stay towards the middle of the frame, it can be very usable for videos. 16mm is also perfect for vlogging at arm's length, but remember, unlike the Zeiss lens, the PZ does not have any optical stabilization, so here's how it looks handheld on a body without IBIS, or with IBIS disabled. Obviously it's wobbly without any stabilization at all. Now here it is with IBIS sensor shift stabilization alone, and I've switched from the A7R Mark IV to the newer A7 Mark IV for these vlogging clips. Considering this clip doesn't have any optical or digital image stabilization, the result is looking okay, and if you can master the stealthy walk, it can look much smoother than my result here. And finally, here's the A7 IV with active stabilization enabled, which applies some digital compensation at the cost of a crop. But since the lens was already ultra wide at 16 to start with, that crop isn't too detrimental, and the additional stabilization has become so much better that I'd say it's well worth the trade-off. If you are into vlogging with a full frame Sony though, do also consider the excellent Sony 1.8G, which is almost as wide, but with a much brighter aperture for a blurrier background, if that's the sort of thing you want. Okay, now before my final verdict, one more comparison for you. Focus breathing, starting with the PZ at 16mm, manually focusing from infinity to the closest distance and back again, where there's a tiny change in magnification, but it's so small it's hardly worth mentioning. And now for the PZ lens at 35mm, again focusing from infinity to the closest and back again, where there's even less evidence of breathing, in fact arguably none at all. So while the new PZ lens is compatible with a focus breathing compensation on models like the A7 IV, I'd say you don't really need it, which makes a refreshing change for a Sony lens. Just for comparison, here's the Zeiss lens at 16mm focusing from infinity to the closest and back again, where it shows a similarly small amount of magnification, but again, I wouldn't say there's anything to worry about here, it's not that distracting. And finally with the Zeiss lens at 35mm, where it more obviously appears to magnify the image as you focus from distant to close. Now, it's not the worst breathing that I've seen, but the fact that it's showing any at all makes it worse than the PZ lens in this regard at the same focal length. Right, now it's time for my final verdict, during which I'll show you a selection of sample images I took with the PZ lens, and as always you can access some of those original images via my review of the lens at cameralabs.com if you'd like a closer look. The Sony PZ 16-35 f4G is a compelling ultra-wide zoom lens for their full-frame mirrorless system, delivering sharp results across the frame and throughout the focal range. The lack of optical stabilization is frustrating for anyone mounting it on a body without IBIS, but the lens is smaller and lighter than most rivals, sealed against dust and moisture, packed with controls including a declickable aperture ring, and it's reasonably priced for the range and aperture. Oh, and it also has a motorized zoom. Now, I've left that to last as I'm still in two minds about it. On the one hand, it is the smoothest power zoom lens that I've tested, with consistent speed and none of the lurching or axial shift that plagues lesser models. It'll deliver great looking zooms for videographers, or simply let you make adjustments from afar without touching it, and that's invaluable for gimbals and drone users alike. But it's also useful if you're in front of the camera for a group shot, a distant selfie, or perhaps a video presentation. And unlike many Sony lenses, it's also almost bereft of focus breathing, especially at the long end. But despite its impressive speed and response for a motorized zoom system, it's still slower than a traditional mechanically linked zoom, which you can twist in a fraction of a second, while the free spinning ring without hard stops or labeling can't help but feel more detached. If you're behind the camera, mostly taking photos, I suspect you'd prefer the exact same lens but with a mechanically linked zoom instead. But that wouldn't be possible since it's the power zoom that actually allows this lens to be so compact. Ultimately, as a videographer, I really like the PZ16-35. I found the power zoom useful, and I hope that a similar approach is applied to a longer or standard range in the future. As a photographer though, I'm torn. Again, I'd have personally preferred a mechanically linked zoom, but there's simply no getting away from the size, weight, range and results, which all make for a highly compelling general purpose lens. I wonder if Sony will deploy a similar strategy for a range of lightweight f4 power zoom lenses in the future. That's the end of my review, but I'd love to hear what you think of the PZ16-35 in the comments, and as always, if you find what I do useful, please do consider giving this video a like and subscribing to my channel. It really helps. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.